The morning of October 24th, 1945, a man is tied to a chair against a stone wall. His hands are shaking not from cold, but from knowing exactly what happens in the next 60 seconds. 10 rifles are raised, and the man staring down those barrels is the reason his own name became a global insult. His name was Vidkun Quisling. And what happened to him that morning was so brutal, so final, that even decades later, historians still argue about whether he deserved mercy or whether death came too easy for him. Welcome back to X History, the channel where we don't just tell you what happened, we make you feel like you were standing there. Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling execution stories of the 20th century, a story of betrayal, power, obsession, and a final walk that the world still remembers with a mix of horror and satisfaction. But before we get into the blood and the bullets, you need to understand who this man really was. Because trust me, the man who died that morning was not the same man who started this story. If dark, real, untold history is your thing, hit subscribe right now. Because this channel drops stories like this every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Norway, early 1900s. A quiet, cold country, mostly forgotten on the world stage. Nobody here expected that one man from this land would one day become so despised, so hated, that his own surname would enter dictionaries as a word for traitor. That man was Vidkun Quisling. He wasn't born evil. In fact, he was brilliant, a military officer, a diplomat, even a humanitarian aid worker in Russia during a famine. People trusted him, people respected him, but somewhere along the way, something shifted inside him, and that shift would change Norway's history forever. By the 1930s, Quisling had founded his own political party, Nazi-occupied. Small, unpopular, mocked even. Nobody took him seriously. But he wasn't chasing popularity, he was chasing power. And power, when chased in the wrong direction, always finds dangerous friends. Because across the border in Germany, a new force was rising, and Quisling watched it, admired it, and eventually aligned himself with it. Here's where the story turns dark. In April 1940, German forces invaded Norway, and in the middle of the chaos, Quisling, live on Norwegian radio, without permission from the king, without an election, without a single vote, in one single broadcast, he handed his own country over to Adolf Hitler. And in doing so, he didn't just betray Norway, he created a brand new word for treason itself. Even today, in multiple languages, Quisling means a traitor who sells out his own people. Imagine carrying that as your legacy. But here's the twist most documentaries skip. Even the Nazis didn't fully trust him at first. Hitler's own generals thought Quisling was an embarrassment. Too eager, too desperate, too obviously hungry for power. For a few tense days, it looked like Berlin might drop him completely. But politics is a strange game, and eventually, Hitler decided a puppet was still useful. So Quisling was installed as Minister-President of Norway. On paper, he ruled his country. In reality, he was a leash held by German hands. And this is where the human side of the story sneaks in, because tyranny, even at its darkest, still has strange personal corners. Quisling was married. His wife Maria, a quiet, devoted woman, stood beside him through all of it, through the whispers, the hatred, the growing danger. While Norwegian resistance fighters plotted in shadows and forests, Maria sat in official residences, watching her husband slowly transform into the most hated man in the country's history. Was it love, loyalty, fear of what leaving might cost her? Historians still debate it, but one thing is certain. She never left his side, not even when the walls started closing in. And they did close in fast, because while Quisling signed decrees and gave speeches praising Nazi Germany, ordinary Norwegians were paying the price. Jewish citizens were rounded up and deported. Quisling's own government helped make it happen. Resistance members were executed. Teachers, priests, students, anyone who resisted the new order faced prison, torture, or worse. And the people of Norway watched their former war hero become the very symbol of their nation's suffering. But here's the chilling part. Quisling didn't seem to see himself as a villain. In private letters and speeches, he described himself as a savior, someone protecting Norway from communism, someone building a greater future. He genuinely believed history would remember him as a visionary. He was wrong, but he wouldn't find out just how wrong until the very end. Because empires built on stolen power always collapse. And by 1945, Hitler's Germany was crumbling from every direction: Soviet troops from the east, Allied forces from the west, and inside Norway itself, a resistance movement that had never stopped fighting in the shadows. Quisling's protectors were vanishing one by one. The soldiers who once guarded him were retreating. The government that once backed him no longer existed. On May 8, 1945, the day Germany officially surrendered, Quisling did something almost unbelievable. Instead of fleeing, instead of hiding, he walked into a police station in Oslo and turned himself in. Why would a man who spent 5 years serving the enemy suddenly surrender willingly? Some historians believe he still thought he could argue his case, defend his actions, maybe even negotiate a lighter sentence. He believed, right until the end, that he could talk his way out of history's judgment. He couldn't, because Norway hadn't forgotten. Not the deportations, not the executions, not the years of fear under his rule. And now, for the first time since 1940, the country finally had him, not as a leader, not as a minister, but as a prisoner. The trial that followed would become one of the most watched, most emotional court cases in Norwegian history. And what happened inside that courtroom would set the stage for the execution that followed, the one caught on real footage. The one that still shakes people who watch it today. But to understand why that firing squad showed him no mercy, you need to hear what happened during his trial first. And trust me, it's more intense than you think. The trial began in late August 1945, inside a packed Oslo courtroom. And from the very first morning, everyone in that room understood this wasn't just a legal proceeding. This was a nation finally getting the chance to look its betrayer in the eye. Reporters from across the world crammed into every available seat. Photographers lined the back walls. And in the gallery sat something far heavier than spectators, survivors of the occupation, people who had lost fathers, brothers, entire families because of decisions this one man made from the comfort of a government office. And through all of it, Quisling sat unnervingly calm, almost too calm, as if some part of him still believed he could walk out of that room as a misunderstood patriot instead of the most hated man in Norwegian history. The prosecution didn't waste a single moment. Charge after charge was read aloud: treason, murder, embezzlement, and the coordination of Norway's Jewish deportations, sending men, women, and children to concentration camps where most would never return. Witness after witness took the stand, and the room grew heavier with every testimony. Resistance fighters described being tortured in prisons his government controlled. Mothers described sons who vanished in the night and never came home. Farmers described neighbors who disappeared simply for whispering the wrong opinion in the wrong company. Slowly, the courtroom stopped feeling like a trial and started feeling like something closer to a national exorcism. 5 years of buried grief finally being spoken out loud. And here's something most people don't know. Quisling actually tried to defend himself using the same argument he'd repeated for 5 straight years: that he hadn't betrayed Norway, he had saved it. Saved it from communism. Saved it from chaos. Saved it from a fate he claimed would have been worse under Soviet influence. He spoke with confidence, almost lecturing the courtroom, as if he still believed that with the right words, he could rewrite how history would remember him. But nobody bought it. Not the judges, not the public outside the courthouse walls, not even, according to several accounts, his own defense team, who reportedly struggled to find any argument that didn't sound like propaganda recycled from a regime that no longer existed. The tide had turned completely. The same confidence that once made him a feared leader now made him look delusional. A man arguing with a reality that had already moved on without him. On September 10, 1945, the verdict was delivered, guilty on nearly every charge brought against him. And the sentence that followed sent a message not just to Norway, but to the entire world watching the collapse of fascist collaborators everywhere: death by firing squad. For the following weeks, Quisling sat inside a small prison cell, and according to guards and later historical accounts, he spent much of that time writing letters, reflections, even philosophical essays, as if trying to control the final narrative of his own life before someone else could write it for him. He wrote to his wife, Maria, the woman who had remained loyally, almost tragically, by his side through every accusation and every collapse of his political world. Some guards later described him as unsettlingly composed, a man who seemed to have already made peace with his fate, or at least convinced himself he had. But there's a difference between peace inside a quiet cell and peace standing in front of 10 loaded rifles. One is imagination, the other is real. That difference arrived on the cold morning of October 24th, 1945, at Akershus Fortress, a location soaked in centuries of Norwegian history, the very seat of national sovereignty he had personally handed over to a foreign power 5 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone standing there that day. This was the same soil he claimed to have protected. Now it would be the last soil he'd ever stand on. He was led out into the freezing morning air, past ancient stone walls that had witnessed kings, sieges, and centuries of Norwegian resilience. And now they would witness his final steps. He was walked to a wooden post and tied firmly in place. A blindfold was offered. Witnesses recall that he stood upright, refusing to visibly shake, refusing to let fear show on his face, perhaps performing one last act of dignity, desperate even now to control how the moment would be remembered. 10 soldiers stood in formation, rifles raised, the fortress silent except for the sound of boots shifting on cold stone and breath fogging in the October air. Time seemed to stretch, that unbearable, suspended second right before an execution, where everything the world knows about a man collapses down into this one final image. Then came the signal. The shots rang out almost simultaneously, echoing off centuries-old stone. And in an instant, Vidkun Quisling, the man who sold his own nation, the man whose surname became a permanent symbol for treason in the English language, collapsed lifeless onto the ground of the very fortress he once claimed to be defending. The grainy black and white footage of that morning still exists today, and when people watch it, they're not just witnessing a man's death, they're witnessing the final chapter of one of history's most infamous betrayals. A man who chased power for years, briefly held an entire country in his hands, and lost everything the moment his protectors vanished from the world stage.